The final episode in the three-part series, SBI Managing Partner Tony Erickson and J.D. Miller, author of The CRO's Guide to Winning in Private Equity, conclude their conversation as they discuss how to navigate the complex transitions of an aging and growing company. Their discussion highlights the many challenges these shifts bring on an operational, strategic, and leadership level, and introduces strategies to proactively address them.
Welcome back, JD. I'm Tony Erickson, SBI's managing partner, and this is our third episode in a series where JD Miller is joining us to discuss his book around how to navigate complex transitions in an aging and growing company. So, JD, this is a fascinating one because, you've seen some companies in their early stage, you've seen them mid stage, you've seen them late stage and hold periods, and I would say there's a lot of variation in those phases, even in what might be a short 4 or 5 year period. So
absolutely,
love to, kind of kick this thing off with your experience in this area and what made it rise to the, key topic within this book. I mean, this is a pretty meaty topic. And what was it that put this one high up on the radar? And you said, no, we got to have multiple pieces of this in the book.
So it actually stems to my first sales job. A long time ago during the dot-com boom, I was employee number 26 of a tech company that 6 years later had gone public with one of the world's largest tech IPOs until Google took the title from us. We were 6,000 employees and a $9 billion valuation when 6 years before we did $750,000 of sales. And it really, I stumbled into it. It was a great first exposure to sales. But during those 6 years, I was learning so many new things because it suddenly became, the thing that you did last year is not what we're going to do this year. It's not the thing we're going to do next year. And, I think someone else wrote a famous book about, what got you here is not what's going to get you there. Yeah. That experience showed it to me, very, very clearly. And now in my later career, I work with small startups in Chicago at the 1871 Tech Incubator. I work with, big tech companies with, 100, 200, $300 million of ARR through private equity connections. And the kinds of advice and the kinds of problems people are facing are really different in each of those contexts at multiple stages between.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that because, what an amazing opportunity that you basically got to see early, mid, late IPO within the first 6 years. What an amazing, crash course, if you will, in the evolution of a company.
I wish I could do it again. I was really going to take notes this time because I didn't know at the time. But, it's really curious. When you see small startups, they've got a really charismatic founder who has a really great idea, and you've got a whole lot of really smart people. You don't have a lot of smart people. You have a handful of people in the company, but all of them are really, really smart. And so, the way the startup goes from $0 in revenue to $1 million or $5 million of revenue is like everyone leans in and does their thing. And then you get to about $20 million in revenue, and the company has grown beyond the scale that any one person can manage. So suddenly, that founder CEO or that, first seller can't have a relationship with every single customer. And then maybe you go through a merger and acquisition, you get bought by a private equity, you get put together with someone else. And overnight, you go from $30 million in revenue to $100 million in revenue. And now it's really a place where, you've got to stay in your lane and have repeatable processes because, just the law of numbers, there aren't that many A+ players in any geography to be able to just kind of free flow it. And you've got beyond the scope of what you're able to touch. And so, that kind of size of business becomes about putting in processes and systems and repeatability. And how do I teach you to do what I do really well so that I can move on and do something else and let that kind of machine run in my absence?
Yeah, it's amazing to hear you talk about this. And when I think about some of the companies that SBI has had the pleasure to work with, when you have those founders in place, it is the most inspiring and frightening thing to see all at the same time. Because to your point, they are often amazing at building products, or they're incredible marketers, or they're amazing salespeople, or they're great engineers. They come from a background, as we all do. But what's fascinating is when you typically move into the PE realm, especially when you're moving into larger PE, you know, they have to become great leaders of leaders, no longer great at being the leader. And I remember one time there was a CEO I was working with, and this individual CEO was better at the job of every one of their direct reports than the direct report. Amazing ability to intake and understand, but it's that whole theory that you're saying that what got you here won't get you there. And far too often, we actually see people who they want to go back to the incubator world because that's what they know and love. And it's not made for everyone, but it's fascinating, when you think about that. And as you click into that, how do you decide when, to challenge someone's leadership style, when you challenge their ideas? Like, when do you decide, hey, we're at an inflection point and we've got to take a different approach?
Yeah, so I think this is a really candid conversation you have to have with your founders, with your leadership team, you know, before you do an acquisition, before you invest in a deal, and make sure everyone's kind of lined up on where do they want to go. You know, there is no shame in saying, I'm a founder who's gotten to this point, and I've decided, the skills to take it to the next level are not mine, and I want to sell the company and take some money and go back and do it again. There are
Mm-hmm.
other folks who really want to continue the journey, and and there you have to have a good candid conversation about you're at this inflection point, and the things that you're going to do need to change. But if you're on board with making that change and learning, we're going to continue to invest in that. You and I work a lot with salespeople, and I see this with first-time sales managers all the time. That a lot of times, I've been an individual contributor, I've been the number one performer, and suddenly I'm the manager of a regional team. And, it's human nature that whatever I did that got me praised before is the thing I want to keep doing. So, I used to get in all the deals and be the smartest guy in the room and talk to all the customers, and that brought me praise and big commission checks. So, of course, now that I'm a manager, I think, oh, I just need to do more of that. And what we find out is actually those managers tap out in their reach really quickly. The manager has to completely shift their focus and say, actually, I now need to sit in the back of the room and empower some other sellers to be there. I might be the person who steps in and helps out every now and then, but we're going to get to the next stage when I stop doing what I used to do. And so those are like I talk about the intersection of business and humanity. Those are the humanity parts about running a business is, what really lights your fire, what motivates you, and then how do you realize how that fits or doesn't fit with where the business is headed?
No, that's great. That's great advice. And one of the things, when we talked about it in episode 2, we talked about a typical hold period is between 4 and 5 years. So let's assume long term to be the end of the hold period. I know it's not decades long thinking,
Sure.
but let's just, for argument's sake, let's say long term is end of a hold period. How do you get leaders to stay focused on the original investment thesis and be looking 5 years down the road rather than, hey, we have to think like an early company, transitional stage? How do you stay focused on the task at hand and ensure that you're doing what it's going to take to achieve that thesis?
Yeah. So in our last episode, we talked a lot about board communication and reporting. And I really do think that what you just said about reminding people of the investment thesis has got to be baked into all of those reports. That, you constantly have to be coming back and saying, there are lots of problems that we could solve. It would be wonderful if we acquired these companies or built a product that did these things or whatever. But the horizon for that is 6 years or 8 years before it could be integrated or built or whatever it is, and there's only 2 years left on the investment. So constantly reminding people that yes, they've got a lot of good ideas, but let's keep going back to whether it's the annual plan for this year, what we set out to do, or a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan. This is the strategy we've all signed on to and say we're going to work towards. And it doesn't mean that the next investor might not come on and then pick up that next great idea. But we've got to kind of stick to our knitting and stay focused on, whatever the plan is today. And it's perfectly okay to opt out of that and say, I'm not interested in that or I'm not inspired by that. and let me go help you find somewhere else that's going to be inspiring.
Yep.
Um,
So, it's interesting that, to hear you use some of those examples. So you've had the you've had the incredible experience of watching a company go from a few million to almost a billion. You've seen numerous companies go from 50 million to over 100. Um, and I would argue that phase, that getting over 100 million, is really challenging. Like, that's when you start to really put in rigor and process and all the things that, people from the Wild West don't like, and entrepreneurs are typically, somewhat allergic to, if you will. So how do you really navigate those major stages, getting over 50, getting over 100, getting over $1 billion? Because they're all very different and stage appropriate, if you will.
yeah. So I think the communication PhD in me constantly says it is about clear communication and constant communication, um, and having the difficult conversations about reality. I'm working with a company right now that's right on that inflection point. They're about 60 million in revenue, and I'm having kind of a daily conversation with one of their top sellers who's been there from the beginning. She was like the third seller that they hired, and getting up to this point she has, been the person who's been able to reach into every deal. Maybe it's not in her territory, but I've been here for so long and I know how to do all of this stuff. Well, now the next phase of this journey, they're not going to have three sellers, they're going to have 55 sellers. And we really do need to have rigor and standards and all of that sort of stuff. Now, that's not a good conversation that she wants to hear because it says your territory is going to get smaller. You're going to get your hand slapped if you start, moving in on someone else's deal that doesn't belong to you. And I know that in the past you've been able to do that and you've actually gotten rewarded for doing that. But it's having that difficult conversation, having that candid conversation, and constantly grounding it in we're here for what's the best thing of the business and the investment thesis that we have for the next 4 years, not necessarily what's best for me or you personally at this moment.
Yeah.
And then we've got a decision to make. You know, either you're inspired and you want to get on that journey and you're gonna change and come with us, or it's perfectly acceptable to say, I don't like that. That's too corporate for me. That's too rigid and structured. I want to go back to a small startup where I'm one of three voices. And that's great too. You can thrive at that and you can be an expert in that kind of domain too.
So that's a great example of the impact to the frontline teams. Now let's talk about the leaders, though, because, you know, there's a lot of blind spots when companies are moving from startup to mature organizations. And what's your advice to leadership when thinking about the blind spots that they don't even know? I mean, you and I have talked a lot about the superseller syndrome and promoting them into management. But if you're the CRO, as titled by the book, what do you need? What corners do you need to be seeing around to guide the company from startup to mature?
Yeah. I think for leaders and especially the C team leadership, it's about being vulnerable and open to change. And we've talked a little bit about how, especially when private equity is your new owner, they have a portfolio of companies that maybe don't look exactly like you, but there's some commonality into the kinds of companies that they invest in. And I think one of the nice things about operating in private equity is they're generally convening all of the CROs together to have conversations about what's going on in the business. And they bring people like SBI to talk about trends. And I think, the best leaders are the ones who can be vulnerable enough to show up in those contexts and say, I don't know everything. I'm willing to try something new. And, I may not be good at it right away, but you're going to get the grace of, being able to make mistakes if you're moving on down that path. I think the biggest mistakes I see, I've been to a couple of companies where they suddenly get bought by private equity or they suddenly merge with another firm, and some leader stands up and tells their team, yeah, we have a new owner, but nothing's going to change. We're somehow unique in the portfolio, and they want everyone else to look like us, and so just keep doing what you're doing. And even though they're asking for these new reporting systems or they're putting in new technology, it doesn't apply to us. Those are the people that get into really dangerous situations because, as we talked about, the things that it took to get to here were important and they were the right choices that got you to this success.
Yeah.
Can we be vulnerable enough to realize I don't know what the future looks like, and maybe it's not the same thing that gets me there.
Yeah, if we're honest, anytime there's a transaction, change of ownership, whether it's private to private, public to private, you know, IPO, there will be operational change. Let's just all admit that that's going to happen, because if there wasn't, then why would the acquisition or the change of ownership occurred in the first place? So one of the sentiments that, you can attest that private equity companies can often be labeled as is, hey, they're just going to raise prices and cut costs, raise prices and remove headcount. Why should companies be cautious about pulling that lever?
Yeah, well, I think that's I think it's a stereotype that really doesn't get to the complexity of the bigger picture about their investments. Yes, when companies are getting bought and sold, they are valued on how profitable are they and how much do they grow. And a lot of folks talk about the rule of 40, that if you add up the percentage of growth year over year to the percentage of profit that business makes, it should add up to 40 or better. Those are great investments. There are lots of ways that you can get there. And so there are some companies that it's going to be all about efficiency. And yes, they are going to have to cut costs and they are going to have to cut heads. Other companies, it's all about the growth side, that actually maybe we're going to be more inefficient because there's a huge market, or you've got a great product, you've got a great way to attack the market. And we're actually going to be unprofitable because we can grow at 50 or 60% year over year. So I think we
Mm-hmm.
have to watch the stereotype that, oh, private equity is just about cost cutting. But I think the most important thing is, if you're hearing private equity getting involved in your business, is to really understand what was that investment thesis. When they
Yeah.
bought the company, what is the thing that they thought is going to add value? And then there are lots of ways for you to contribute to that new value, as long as you know what the roadmap is going to be.
Agreed. And this is one of those things that I threw the stereotype out there for just the sake of starting the dialogue, because you and I have seen plenty of private equity firms make an investment and then, for all intents and purposes, pour gas on a fire and just want to add lots of R&D, improve the product, be acquisitive, add more headcount. It's not uncommon, but there are stigmas attached and people have certain beliefs, and it's not always fair, nor is it always true. I think one of the things that's really important is where you were going with that. It comes back to the investment thesis, and there's lots of ways to grow a company, there's lots of ways to create enterprise value, and as leaders, depending on where you are in that stage of evolution, that stage of ownership, it's probably not going to be well received to make massive investments in year 5 of a hold period that was anticipated to be 5 years.
Right.
However, the great companies we see, they do that early and then they realize the benefits, then they often even sell earlier, and everyone tends to be in a much better place. It's those that sometimes ignore the problem and don't actually make the change soon enough when we're talking about that operational change, because they think, oh, we're not going to be messed with, we're going to be ring fenced. We've all heard all the terms.
Yeah.
Those typically end up getting reanalyzed at some point in the hold period, and usually status quo is not necessarily the path forward.
Well, and I think having conversation about change is hard. And as humans, we want to avoid difficult conversations and, you know, not discuss some of the messy, ugly stuff. Um, but if you don't, in the absence of communication, then none of these decisions make any sense. And it is just like, oh, these new corporate overlords are doing these terrible things. They don't know anything about the business. I've been unfortunate enough to see lots of employees name me by name in their Glassdoor reviews about, here came JD and he doesn't know anything about what we've done, and he's changed all of this stuff that's core to who we are. That's a communication gap that I haven't done a good job to explain, that yes, we're changing the golden goose, we're moving the goalpost for what success used to look like, because they've just seen the outcome, what it means to them, but they haven't understood the bigger picture.
Yeah. Well, you've heard the old adage: everyone supports change until it happens to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And That's human, and that's about humanity. And we train ourselves, we get rewards for doing certain things, and so we want to keep doing the things that bring us rewards. We adopted a dog in our house a couple of years ago, but she's learned the behaviors that get her rewarded. And all of a sudden, winter's coming to Chicago. And so she's used to, like, she goes and rings this bell and the back door opens and she gets to go out there. Well, now all of a sudden it's, 8 degrees below zero in Chicago today. She rings the bell. We're not opening the door and sending you out. First, we have to go stop somewhere else and put on your winter coat and do all of this stuff. And she's totally confused by that because she's like, I used to ring this bell, I used to get this reward, and now you're making me do something totally different. It's harder to communicate to a dog than it is a person. Like, yes, we're changing what you used to do. It is for your own good. You're not going to get frostbite. Go with me on this. Be vulnerable to the idea that something new is going to happen, and maybe you're going to be happy as a result.
JD, my wife texted me today because she took our dog to the vet. He's a lab. He gained 12 pounds because apparently he's been enjoying lots of the holidays. And,
yeah. All of us have.
Change is about to happen to him. So he's going to experience some change, probably chase a few more tennis balls, put some discipline into that exercise regimen. So, but it's that old adage, no one likes change until, and so that's the difficulty that we got to deal with as leaders. And, we've got to inspire people to be a part of the change and, be the change that they want to be a part of.
That's right. That's right. And as leaders, also remember the humanity of people that, we talk a lot about, investment thesis, and as CRO, I'm always looking at a P&L and what's our profitability. It is also really important for us to remember that, a company is actually a bunch of individuals. And so the more we can think about the humanity of the individuals, we might not do things that they want, but we can at least treat them respectfully, honestly, communicate well to them, give them advance warning about things that are going to happen, and that makes it better for everybody.
No, I think that's a great point to wrap this series on. I mean, the ages and stages of organizations cause lots of change for those in the organizations, lots of opportunity for those in the organization. So as leaders, we need to be inspiring to what that future looks like. Want, to bring those people on for a ride. They'll gain amazing skills along the way, just as you have throughout your career. And they need to understand the potential that it could create for them within their own personal career, as well as the company that they're working for. So, JD, thank you again for joining us in this 3-part series. If you haven't had the chance to watch any of the others, please go back and look at them. And JD, on behalf of SBI, we really thank you for participating in this webinar series with us and congratulate you on the book. And I am waiting for my signed copy, but in the meantime, I've got the digital version, and the signed copy should be here soon, I'm told.
I put it in the mail today. Thanks so much, Tony. Thanks for having me.
JD, thank you very much.
Visit sbigrowth.com to read SBI's latest research, join upcoming events, or learn about SBI's GTM services. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and connect with us on LinkedIn.